Welcome to the next episode of the Leadership Lab. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Irene Tracey, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford. Welcome, thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure, absolute pleasure, lovely to be here.
So we talk a lot with our scholars about leadership being a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
Where did it all begin for you?
Well, that's a great question. I think it depends on what you define yourself as sort of leadership and where it begins. And it can start, as small as just being the captain of the hockey team at school through to other types of things where you've sort of been put into leadership. And I do remember from primary school onwards, people always said you were a born leader, and I never quite understood what that meant. But I did often find myself in those positions. I was always very sporty and involved in, lots of activities at school. And I didn't shy away from taking on that responsibility. I knew that I enjoyed that type of thing. But then, throughout the arc of my career, I've very much had that sort of individual academic role as well as a sort of, PI scientist doing my thing without necessarily taking on leadership. And then as one's academic career progresses, I think quite early for me, I then also was sort of encouraged to take on some of these leadership roles, whether it was sort of running the imaging centre or taking on a department headship. And although it wasn't necessarily something I was seeking, I think I've often referred to myself as a slightly reluctant leader, in that I've never sort of actively gone and sought those, but people always want me to do them. Same being the VC, I had absolutely no intention of being Vice-Chancellor. And I know that from that sort of long journey, I do enjoy creating environments and spaces for people to flourish. So I knew I wasn't against the idea, but I also know the cost that comes with it in terms of the time that it takes away from your passion, which is, for me, being a scientist. So it's been this sort of funny journey where I've been a sort of born leader, whatever that means. I've done things, I know I enjoy them. I've tried to not do it. I've actively not sought it, but ended up always somehow in leadership roles and still enjoying them. And, to this day, feeling very much that it's a privilege to take on some of these responsibilities. They're not without their challenges, for sure. But I do derive a lot of personal satisfaction out of what one can do in those roles and with those platforms. So it's not a very clear answer, because I still feel I'm on my leadership journey. I think it's something that you're always just reflecting on and trying to improve. But it's been something that's been quite lifelong, probably, for me, if I look back and think from those early days in primary school, people saying that to me.
What do you think it was that they saw? What were the key traits that made them say you're a born leader?
Well, I think, again, in my career, I think we've gone from a model when I was quite young where people sort of had a stereotype of what a leader was to that being completely demolished. And I think that's great. And that, one of the things I always say to people is there's no one template. You have to find your leadership style. And actually there's plenty of space, rightly, for many different types of leaders. And you can't and you mustn't just, you can be inspired and look at people that you definitely don't want to be like or you really admire, but you've still got to find your own sort of identity in that so that it's authentic. And that naturally probably taps into things that's just about your phenotype or your character. So for me, I think probably what people were looking at was, I am a very positive person. I'm a sort of born optimist. And so the sort of positivity, I've got a lot of energy, so I'm a naturally energetic person. I have a naturally positive disposition about, what's possible and getting things done. And I think those elements tend to, I've noticed, energize people. People know that I'm really honest and authentic. I will, say things that either can be said or can't be said, and that's it. I'm not shy away from just being really direct and honest with people, and I think people feel that they can trust me in that regard. So I think those are a few of the things that probably are my character traits that people valued and felt would be good in the different positions of either rallying the hockey team to, go from 2-0 down to win the match or whatever it might be.
And you say you didn't seek out the role of VC. But knowing your predecessor, Louise, as well, who I also think is, a very intelligent, very strong, very truthful person, do you think people saw those similarities and thought, oh yes, that makes sense to have somebody else like that? or were they looking for something different?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you have to ask the committee that. And the committee, is an elected group of individuals that's drawn from every aspect of the collegiate university. And I think every time they come to the sort of 7-year cycle, they reflect on what's been and then they reflect on what they want for this next phase. So I think it does naturally have a change. And Louise is a good friend, I like her very much. We're actually very different people, so we're not similar in that regard, and I think people recognise that. Of course, people knew me well because I'd been here my whole career, and they'd seen me in leadership roles, running a department, running a college, running an imaging centre and a team. So you've sort of been on the job, if you like, and people have known very much what my style would be, which would be, different in many regards. And I think that's sort of when they gather, they decide what it is they feel for this next step of the university's evolution they are looking for. And as I say, I had no intention of doing it. I was perfectly happy running my lab and running my old college. But there was a lot of sort of missives to encourage me to apply. And actually, I frankly just said no for 6 months, not interested at all, because I knew that would be the end of my science life and there'd be no return. But after 6 months of sort of being badgered, I sort of thought, fine, I'll put my hat in the ring to find out a bit more about it and go through the process. And that was when I sort of discovered myself. Actually, I can sort of see why, and I think for this next phase, I would really enjoy it, and I can sort of see why people would want me there. And I think there was, it was a benefit that it wasn't that they were seeking somebody who was internal. That was just what happened. And so that wasn't particularly a criteria. But, maybe it's a culmination of, those different aspects that they just felt at this point in time, it would be good to have somebody who just could bring the skill sets that I've got and the knowledge base around the sort of collegiate university.
You are born and bred Oxford, aren't you?
Yeah.
What do you think are the pros and cons of having somebody who's so living and breathing Oxford versus bringing in somebody from the outside?
Yeah, I think the benefits, there's two sort of ins, if you like. One is I'm a born and bred person of the city, and so I know the city, I know the region, I know the importance of an anchor institution and how it can be and should be in its geographical positioning and its location. So there's that side of understanding. Then, of course, I've been here since I was 18, apart from 2 years at Harvard. So it's a place that I know as an undergraduate, a graduate, an early career researcher, a faculty, examiner, a tutor, a head of department. So I've sort of done every job bar this one. I think also the other thing that I've realised as a pro is I'm tolerant and forgiving, if you like, of some of the madness of the place and the eccentricities of the place that rightly would drive an external mad. I think particularly if you've come in, as we've had 3 previous ones, you've come in from a more centralised university model of running. This is not that. So it's a very different way of leading an institution because of the devolved sort of federal structure, and it requires a very different way of negotiating and getting things done. I love it and I forgive it and I can tolerate the frustrations of it because I'm of it, and I accept responsibility that I've been an academic here, so I've sort of slightly made it the way it is. And that allows me to sort of still be, seriously, 3 years in, as energised and as positive about the place as I was on day one, and I don't see that waning. I've done a few things which I did at the start deliberately for my own sanity, if you like, or just, desire to not get distant too quick. And I've realised that's actually been a really secret weapon for me to maintain this level of positivity and energy. And that was to make sure I built in lots of visits to departments. I do deep dives, colleges, student breakfast, dog walks and things, so that I have contact points on a regular basis where I'm really just finding out how he's doing. Partly it helps you just go out and be energised to realise actually everybody's fine. 98% of the place is great and fine. And then you go back to your day job where you're dealing with all the things that are not going well, and you're putting the fires out. And I think if you don't do that in these roles, you can get quite a funny optics on the institution because you're only seeing it through the lens of the things you're dealing with. And I built that in because I didn't want to get distant. As an academic that loves the place and believes in the place and respects my academics and my students, I wanted to have the joy of still being with them, and I realised actually that's probably why I'm unusually amongst my peer group still incredibly positive and loving it and really enjoying the role. And I think, well, if I can't be positive, then we're really doomed.
When you started at Oxford, you must have been in a minority as a comprehensively educated student. What did that experience do for you in terms of thinking now about making sure that all incredibly smart students have access to the university and making sure that everybody feels welcome and that they flourish when they're here?
No, it's a great question. We could spend the whole interview talking on this issue. I think the first thing to say is, I came up, so I'm 59, so it was, many, many years ago. Actually, it wasn't unusual to be from a comprehensive school. There was quite a lot of us.
Percentage-wise?
Probably back then, actually I don't know because we didn't have the data then, so I wouldn't know, and so this would be anecdotal. But so the first thing to say is it wasn't that unusual. I'll come back to sort of what was observations, and I think that was because I was mostly in scientist, and therefore there was actually enough of us around. So you didn't feel at all that you were the odd one out in any way. There were other maybe groups that were definitely not present, but that state school wasn't, or comprehensive school wasn't unusual. And my school always sent, a couple each year to Oxford or Cambridge. So again, that wasn't unusual for, state schools. So going forward, we tend to focus more on, as I always say, talent is every opportunity is not. And as we've become better and smarter at going out and taking our message out to the world, if a kid doesn't want to come here, having really understood what it's like and spent time with our unique summer programme or on a visit to a college, that's fine. But don't please not apply because you've been told or you've read some nonsense about us that's propagating a myth of this place that's 100 years old, which still happens. The tropes that come out are just so frustrating. So that's the work we do. That's sort of the journey we're on. There's just always work to do. It's about getting your message out and saying if the pipeline applying to us represents broader society, our job is done, and that's what we're working on. And to fill that pipeline, my experience is we're not going to fill it unless we go out and take our message out and give people opportunity to see what Oxford really is. And we're exploring further with different social media platforms how we get that, how we can really make sure that we're using the right channels to get our message out, because we know that that's difficult because there's just always this sort of presentation. Now, going back to sort of what were some of the unusual things, I think this is still would be observed, but this isn't just for people from state schools or even socioeconomically deprived schools. This is just people coming from different types of systems, and it could have been coming here as a graduate, haven't been to another university, is just when you come to a place like Oxford, even though compared to my counterparts in the US, who we still beat on the rankings, but have, eye-watering sums of endowment, we're still really tight financially, but nonetheless, the provision that we give is very visibly astounding and fantastic. And I think you just observe that as something that is really quite exceptional. And that's not just the living environment of the opportunity to live in these incredibly historic, 13th century buildings, but state-of-the-art labs, book grants, travel grants, the wealth of how the different research groups are supported. It's not perfect. There's always areas that we need to help. We need to help with disparity between the colleges and departments. But there is a very noticeable difference in just what that looks like. And that's not just coming from the school to the university, which I think you would observe more if you've gone to a school that doesn't have as many facilities compared to a kid that maybe has gone, to school with lots of provision. My 3 children have gone from they've done half state at primary and half private. And you just see, it's just phenomenal what they have as their facilities and opportunities, all of which they maximised, the benefit from. That is different. So I think just the quality of provision is where you probably observe, you will see that through the lens of the school system you've been through more acutely than maybe if you've come from a school where that's just very normal to have fantastic facilities. And so those would be some of the things I think that one would observe. I think, as I say, it's not just state private, male, female, there's, changes there. And then we have other, minority groups where, when I was running my college, we had to really, we spent a lot of time listening to alum and others, particularly from the black community, about just, how did they feel about the portraiture, just the physicality of what you're in, how welcoming is that? So there's some really simple things you could do. The offer of, celebrating different, faith events, different meals, portraiture. There's a lot that you can just do. It's quite simple, quite low-hanging fruit, and can completely just change the environment. So you feel like you're not having to become something else. Goes back to that being authentic you. You can be exactly who you are. and you are welcome here, and we're the ones that's going to do the changing. And I think that's what, you know, we're just always trying to recognise that and think about how do we make sure we're listening enough in order to do that well.
You mentioned finances just now, and one of the things that struck me in your first oration, when you've been, I think, Vice-Chancellor for sort of 3 months, and you talked about how precarious the finances were. Couple questions. One, you've been at the university for so long. Was it a surprise to you that the finances were so precarious? And two, what needs to be done about it?
Yeah, no, so my comment was specifically on the sector, not Oxford. And of course, I've not been a VC, so I wasn't privy to that data until I came into the role as Vice-Chancellor. And then you talk to your peer groups and you have these, you know, really, I find them incredibly useful meetings with the Universities UK. That's the whole lot that goes, you know, the 150 odd that goes from, you know, small drama or music schools through to big research intensives. And then you have the Russell Group, that's the research intensives. And the thing I learned very quickly by joining those groupings was the realisation how precarious the funding model was for them, because, you know, they don't have some of the financial levers that we have in Oxford. So it was partly to alert people that this thing that within the sector we've been talking about needs to go more public. And I'm very mindful I have a platform, and right or wrong, if I say something, it does get attention. So therefore I'm very mindful. You'll note in all my media interviews, you know, I don't just wave the flag for Oxford. Of course, I'm proud to be representing Oxford. I will largely always speak on behalf of the sector, because I'm very mindful of the responsibility I have to champion the sector, to remind people how brilliant the sector is one of our great British brands. I mean, we are phenomenally good. Most countries would bite our government's hand off to have the higher education sector we've got in Britain. We do it on a shoestring. But, you know, we've been saying this for a few years amongst ourselves, and we need to get that more publicly aware. And that's why I wanted to use that platform to remind people that, you know, Oxford is just about fine. You know, I run a 3.5 billion turnover. We just about break even. And I've got 4 big levers financially that others don't have. Now, I'm running something more expensive than most people with my, you know, we're running some of the great world's museums and libraries and collections of the world. We're running, you know, really expensive 13th century medieval listed buildings. That's not cheap to keep up. We're research intensive, which we subsidise all that. And we're very British undergraduate, more so than most, 80%. And of course, we subsidise that massively with the expensive teaching model. So, you know, we can do all that, which is a lot more expensive than many other places, because I've got, you know, I've got an endowment, which we keep trying to grow with generosity of alum and other helpful, you know, philanthropy that is not common in the British higher education sector, very common in America. That is something that we've really got to address. Think about how do we incentivise giving back to your university. That will make such a difference to universities if there was more of a philanthropic culture. Brits are really charitable, but for some reason we've got a blockage about giving it back to a university, unless it's Oxford and Cambridge and a few others. So we've got to think about how do we incentivise that. So I have philanthropy, because I have this endowment. We have increasingly our spin-out returns, so that's going really, really well. It's not the big lever yet, but it's becoming a very big lever. We have the world's biggest university press, which helps, you know, facilitate that. So we've got, you know, we've got various extra financial levers that help me break even, but for the rest of the sector, that's more problematic. So if they want to stay research intensive and they want to keep teaching British kids, they've had to go down more of the international student route, where the fee is unregulated, so that they can offset the costs of teaching, because that regulated fee for 12 years is now worth £6,500. And we've just done now finally the analysis here of what actually is the cost of teaching our undergraduates, and it's between £20,000 and £25,000 a year. So you're subsidising £18,000 a year for every single student. And actually the really interesting fact is there's not a big difference between, say, a medic or a historian. You'd have thought it'd be a lot more, but it's not coming out too different. So that is a huge subsidisation that we're making. Thankfully we can, but for others it's just not sustainable. So there does have to be this conversation. I know that there'll hopefully be a big piece of work that will be done, and we have to really have probably quite a difficult conversation in the country about what do we want out of our higher education sector, how are we going to fund it, how are we going to support, you know, kids to go, who goes, who gets funded, all these things. And we're just, because we can't go on like this this, or you could just let it organically go on, but I do worry what that will lead to. So as I say, we're fine, but the fact is, we're in the better place than most, even though I've got these other expenses, and it's still uncomfortably tight.
You spoke early on about being at Harvard, and that's sort of the only other place that you really spent important time. And of course, that was when you were really focused on your research.
Yes.
And I think you've talked about having a eureka moment around the understanding of pain.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, and also how your findings around pain actually not being a response to the incident, if I've got this right, or to the injury?
Yeah.
What does that have any sort of transferable insight to what it means to lead and to help people make decisions about where there's going to be pain in making choices in finance or anything else?
It's so funny you say it. So many people, when I started, were like, well, you've had the perfect training to become a Vice-Chancellor because you're sort of an expert in pain, dishing it out, receiving it, hopefully bringing relief as well. So the constant for my sort of scientific career has been, a training and expertise in these, what we call non-invasive imaging techniques, and magnetic resonance techniques that allow you to look at the living animal and to get information about what's going on in your muscle or your brain from that, and then interpret that to symptoms or things. So that's sort of the techniques, and for those who are interested, it's under the magnetic resonance umbrella, like an MRI machine, but with extra bells and whistles you can get different types of data, like chemical data, and then you can get data about how blood is flowing to a particular part of the brain to feed it to work, so you can map which bits of the brain is doing what job. So it's a sort of functional brain mapping. So those techniques is what I've been expert in. I've used them in different contexts and different diseases in the early period of my graduate work and postdoc work in Boston. And then I was sort of aiming to come back to set up one of these functional imaging labs here in the UK, well, in Oxford. And just a chance conversation over at Mass General, where I was working at Harvard, in the coffee room with some people who were working in the pain clinic at Mass General, about how difficult it was to know behind the oral description of somebody's pain or the manifestation behaviourally what actually is going on. Why is this person in so much pain? Is there sort of amplification mechanisms that we can't see? Why is there sometimes a mismatch between what they say and what we're measuring? And it sort of struck me, well, here I am, an expert in these techniques that can go under the skin or behind the scenes and see what's actually measuring going on. And here's one of the most private, subjective, challenging topics that's been the subject of philosophers and others since time immemorial, and we know nothing about it. It's got a huge, one of the biggest clinical health problems, and it just seemed that was a confluence that couldn't be missed, and there was nothing that we knew. So I decided then, when I was coming back to the UK, I'd work on that. And it's really interesting, because on reflection, I've been saying this a lot to people on sort of more, mentorship talks about science and being a scientist, is in my day it was more easy to move topics. You might have a constant training of a technique, but you could dabble in different things, and that was really good because you could draw on different areas. I'd worked on Duchenne muscular dystrophy, mitochondrial encephalopathies, AIDS dementia complex, very different disorders. At the end of the day, biology is going wrong, and there's only certain common ways that things go wrong, but very different areas that, again, you can draw from. And it meant also I could come into the pain field having sort of been seasoned a little bit as a sort of, maturing scientist with a constant skill in certain techniques. But I hadn't been trained from the sort of stables of pain labs. So I could come in and just say, why do you think about it like that? I hadn't been sort of slightly brainwashed. I think these days, my worry is that we don't allow, it's not so easy because of funding restrictions, for people to dabble a little bit and go, and then maybe come into an area where they might spend the rest of their career like I did, having not been slightly maybe trained to think in a certain way about the topic. And I think that's healthy. So, and I've been having this conversation quite a lot recently as to sort of how do we facilitate that a bit more, because it's good for the field. I like to think it's good for the field. I came in and, some of our first papers, they were really high profile because we just came in and we just disrupted the way people thought about it, because we weren't sort of brainwashed into thinking about it in a certain way. And I could draw on all those different skills. And so that sort of was that moment. It's like, wow, I happen to have all probably the right training and approaches, and I can just attack this problem, and there's everything to discover. And so for the past 35 years, that's where I've worked. And I sort of call it, I've worked in the gap between injury and perception. And that gap, in most circumstances, is linear. You know, if you put your finger in a candle and it's of a low flame and you build it up, it's just going to hurt more, right? It's a nice linear relationship if you just sort of turn up the heat. But even in everyday pain that you and I will experience, you know there'll be situations where you didn't feel it. You're in sports, high arousal, you distract your child when they're having a vaccine jab on their leg, or you were listening to a great bit of music and it didn't seem to hurt so much. These things are not, the body tricking you. There's physiological mechanisms that make that the case, that you can completely bring down the perception, even though the injury might be throbbing away. But on that journey up into the brain, there's many points at which it can be just dampened down, because in that situation, it's not important for you to experience the pain. And that can happen even in a chronic state. And then in the chronic state, you get these very, very common non-linearities, that the injury can be huge and no pain. It can be tiny and huge pain, or no injury and huge pain, and everything in between. So that sort of non-linearity between injury and perception, and the journey from the injury into the spinal cord, up the spinal cord into the brain, all the places in the spinal cord and the brain where those amplifiers get turned up and down, is what we've worked on and worked out. So we've worked out, why is it that when you're distracted, it doesn't hurt so much? When you go to the dentist and you're really fearful, it hurts a lot more. Why is it when you're sad, it hurts more? Why is it, when you have a particular injury and it gets sensitized, this whole amplification mechanism sets off. All these things that can really turn the volume up and down to the same injury and contribute to that non-linearity and that gap. That's what we've worked on and unmasked. And then that obviously has huge translational potential in lots of different situations. Which is, of course, what the group and the team are carrying on working. And I've trained lots of people, and they're all now running their own teams and groups and doing great. So they're carrying on the work. Obviously, I can't run a lab, and I knew I couldn't run a lab doing this job, which is partly why I didn't want to do it, because I wasn't sure I wanted to make that sacrifice. But I am very pleased that the joy and the reward I get of running this place that I love so much and believe in so much more than offsets the personal loss of not running my own research team and the joy of discovery, which is still a thrill. So that's basically, in a nutshell, pain, the biggest medical health problem in the world. Great, interesting, basic neuroscience, philosophical question, lots still to discover. It's a lot more complex than people think, but people will just have probably got their own pain experiences where they'll get what I mean by going to the dentist and that. And what we've worked out is, yes, anxiety is literally an amplifier inside your brain that just turns the volume up from 8 to 10. And if you are distracted, then it just turns the volume down. And we've worked out all the mechanisms that evolution has put into your brain to make it so. And then obviously on the translational side, it's sort of what goes wrong in chronic pain. What are the mechanisms that just hold people in these terrible pain states? How can we then unlearn and unreverse that? And then working a lot with pharma to help develop new analgesics that will come through the pipeline and hopefully, relieve this huge, huge problem.
Completely fascinating.
Yeah, it's a great field. People should go into it if they're listening and they're thinking of an area. There's lots still to discover.
You've talked a lot about anxiety and also discovery. And it strikes me that one of the biggest challenges for universities is actually allowing for discovery without creating anxiety. And so one of the big challenges that I think universities all across the world are dealing with is, how do you allow for free speech and also making sure that people do feel safe and that it's in an inclusive environment. I know you had to deal with some of those challenges when you started. What do you think about that now?
Yeah, I think, again, there's this mismatch between what's presented and what actually is going on. And as we've said many times, not just me, but people who are heads of department and other, we actually have, and even our students in student survey reports, they are very positive about the free speech culture we have in this university. So we don't actually have a problem with free speech at all. And that just isn't the case. I think the journey that we're on with our students is, one, to just maintain that, of course, and to remind them that part of that free speech is how they live their lives and conduct their lives as people, as members of communities or college or family, and how that's going to be in the adult world when they're in the workplace, and how, as part of their learning and their subject learning, you learn about different points of view. If you're taking a historical moment, you will read this piece of literature on that one, this one, that one. You're very comfortable taking different people's hypotheses and viewpoints. That's what we teach you to do. That's what you need to do in your everyday life as well, is that there's going to be different viewpoints. And so reminding them that there's nothing new here, I found that quite a helpful way for those that maybe are struggling a little bit with some of the speech that is, hurtful and unpleasant, sits on the side of legal, but, is nevertheless having consequences, is one, you've got to develop some resilience around that, but also the person giving that also needs to learn we don't live in the abstract. We don't live as just, automons and agents. We're human. And just because, I said this just in my recent oration, just because you can say it legally doesn't mean to say you should. Yeah. And if you think that it's not going to have a consequence, well, then you are going to really be tripped up when you go out into the big wide world of work. So it's about reminding yourself we're all social animals. We're all living in communities of our colleges or our departments. Please just have a bit of kindness. So I've been emphasising a lot about kindness and hope as just really underrated but vitally important things to remember, to inculcate in your character, and to remind yourself that when you do say something that is maybe legally okay but quite hateful, it will have a repercussion. And is that really what you want to do? And if you think there isn't consequences of that, well, I'm sorry, you're going to get pulled up short. So it's about sort of, again, when they're young, helping them understand that. I do feel it's really tough for students, though, a lot more difficult for them than it was in my day, because of just the ease with which we could go to the pub and have a row and discuss and whatever, and you could change your mind. You could be trying on different political identities and et cetera, and all that was fine and was a lot more easy just to chop and change. Social media definitely, the commentary for people on them and what they said and how they are is just, I can't imagine what it is. I don't do social media, and I'm not going to, at this stage of my career. And I really appreciate how much tougher it is for them. And that's where I think, we can't and have no jurisdiction on the social media platforms. But that's where a lot of this is going horribly wrong and is really difficult for them to manage. And we're doing our best to try and help them understand how to navigate that, how to, be, again, respectful on it, how to manage it when it, you're being trolled, all these issues that they are dealing with. I think our generation need to appreciate just how difficult it is for them. There's some great things about social media, but a lot of it is really difficult to navigate. And it's coming very quickly at them. And of course, you have a melting pot in a university where you've got, a lot of young people trapped naturally at a stage where they are trying out different viewpoints, and that's great. And you want them to do that. And you want to create an environment and a space where that's good. But we shouldn't underestimate how hard it is for them. And we can just do as much as we can whilst they're with us and hope that that builds up a bit of, again, boundaries, understanding, tolerances, kindness, and ways to mitigate and a bit of resilience for them, as they go into the adult world. And, the one thing we've done is model it by just showing them different things with our Sheldonian series, taking really difficult topics and just showing them these are different ways you can discuss a topic, and this is what good looks like in reasoned, argued debate, and they love it. They're really popular. So as I say, I think we've actually got quite a healthy culture, and it's not the case necessarily everywhere, but I think in Oxford, but we're not complacent. We're constantly working on it, and safety is a very key issue. So you're absolutely right. People, you're not going to get the best out of people. They're not going to thrive if this is what I say when people are trying to force the EDI issue into a DEI. It's not DEI. We don't do quotas. We're nothing like how it's gone in America. And there's nothing new about EDI. And I was amazed, in my oration, I was sort of just reminding people about there's nothing new here. We've always striven to get excellence and get the best people in. And having run a lab, if you really find the best people in the world to run your lab, to do the best science, naturally that group will be a diverse group of people. The trick then is they've got to feel that they're treated equally and they feel included. That's EDI. Nothing new in 1,000 years. Somehow this got, then as if, I'm running some woke, thing agenda. It's like, that was precisely not what I said. It's just unbelievable. So again, we've just got to keep with our messaging. We've got to keep reminding that, and also reminding people there's nothing new here. We've always tried to do this. And
some people have.
Yeah. You're right. But there's always work for improvement. Yeah. Exactly right. But the journey that we're on over 1,000 years is we're always, for better, for worse, at times, you know, with really good effects, at times, you know, we definitely need more improvement. But the whole point is, in theory, we are trying to bring the best students in from whatever background, teach them by the best faculty from, you know, the global talent we've got, and make sure that when both those two sides are there and the magic is happening, you will get the best out of that and the best excellence if people feel they can thrive. And when people thrive, it's because they feel that they are treated equally and they feel included. And that's EDI, right? And again, it's core business for us as an excellent institution. And
So it should be. We have a tradition on the lab where the last guests ask the next guest a question.
Right, yes.
I think to a large extent you've actually answered it, but I'm just going to say it in case there's anything you want to add to it before I ask you what you'll ask the next guest.
Right, yeah.
So Joe Clark, former Prime Minister
Yes.
of Canada,
Yeah.
asked, what should we do to try and encourage constructive conversation in an increasingly divisive age, and to make sure that the conversation lasts outside of the room that it's in?
That is a good question. I mean, I think I probably have addressed that in terms of the cultural environments, and it's about everybody recognising they own this problem. It can't just come from top down. You know, things stick and they have sustainability if everybody owns it, and it's more bottom up and top down. So top down, I can do some institutional things like the Sheldonian series and create, you know, different types of conversations, different ways of having dialogue to mirror and showcase what that looks like around difficult topics, and people can go away and talk about that further. But you've got to break it down into, again, whether you're a PI running a lab, whether you're running a department, whether you're running a college, we've got to all own creating those spaces and those environments where you're not shy of taking on a difficult conversation, but you also have the confidence to put the boundaries around what's acceptable behaviours, because you still got to teach, they're young adults and they still got to learn what to do. And then you hope that that will then have a sustainability, because those conversations will carry on and they'll start modelling that. So it's sort of teach the teacher and train the trainer and get that to go. And there's ways you can do that top down, there's ways you can do that bottom up, but it's about everybody's in this together. And I don't have an answer as to how to do that on the social media platforms, because I think that is just a bigger challenge. And it's interesting to see the Australia experiment.
Yeah, very.
And we'll have to see how that plays out. But, you know, in a university, we're naturally doing that, as I say, in our educative piece. So it's about just being really imaginative and creative about reminding people there's nothing new here. This is how you're learning, and you love that. Now you just need to do it in the pub or wherever you are as well.
And what would you like to ask our next guest,
right,
who I can tell you is the CEO of a FTSE 100 company?
Terrific. Okay, well, the one that we haven't touched on is sort of, not that there is any life outside of the day job, because it's the one thing I have learned is that you're sort of on 24/7. But I would like to ask them what they do to, you know, it sounds a bit of a cliche question, but what they do to relax. What I mean about that is what and how do they build into their busy schedule some space? Because, you know, to do these jobs well, you still need to be able to have that re-energisation. I go out to those departments, I do those meetings with students, walk my dog, Jeffrey Biscuit, with them, and these are really important things. I run, so I keep a bit of fitness in, and that's really good for sort of buffering the stress and keeping energised and keeping on point, I think. So I'd love to ask the next person, particularly if they're coming from the more private sector and business world, what do they do to make sure that they are, you know, they're as energised and they're aware of what's going on at the coalface, but they're building in just that space a little bit to make sure that their brain has a little bit of chillax time so that they can keep on the day job. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you to you, and thank you for all the work that you do, and the foundation is absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that you've, you know, focused on some of these really important aspects that we've sort of touched on a little bit, but around the importance of, again, building the types of people we want to build for the future, to be those leaders that, again, can navigate, you know, some of those challenges.
Complexity.
It's really, exactly, it's all about the complexity, and it's about, again, whilst we've got them, really helping to then encourage and take a more ethical, you know, and, you know, more, as I say, a kinder approach to the world.
They can
and
lead
to
with
each other.
integrity.
Exactly right. Yeah,
and
so thank you for that. It's really important. Yeah, we'll do
it's
our
a
bit.
pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
Good.